We are now in the third passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, which is the continuation of the story of Peter's restoration into his fellowship with the disciples as well as with Jesus Christ. And if you recall, it began with an invitation from Jesus to come and dine. And Peter had put himself in a spot where he was going to try things on his own. In fact, he was no longer going by Peter, he was going by Simon. He had returned to the old man, so to say. Jesus invites him to come and dine, and then after that, he begins to work in his heart and offering him the forgiveness that comes with being restored. Today we enter into the actual restoration that occurs. And it's a familiar passage, which we read earlier. And instead of just going through it verse by verse, I wanted to organize things a little bit differently because the same thing happens 3 times. And so we're going to look at different pieces of what happened each time. The first thing I want to consider is, what happened to Peter? As I mentioned, the name Peter is now gone. If I look at verse 15, so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah." And then in verse 16, he said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah." And then a third time in verse 17, he said to him, "Simon, son of Jonah." You get the idea. I think the problem was Simon was no longer Peter in his own heart. He had fallen away. And if you recall, Peter had fallen in a pretty dramatic way. On the night in which Jesus was betrayed, Peter denied him 3 times. The man who had been following Jesus step by step, who left everything he had to follow him. Jesus had called him the rock, which is what Peter means, from the Greek Petros, or in the Jewish it would have been Cephas. That was supposed to be a character trait of this man. A foundation, solid, strong. And yet, here he was on the night when Jesus needed him most, denying that he even knew him. And he didn't just do it once, he did it 3 times. Scared by a little servant girl who thought she recognized him. So he was ashamed, and he was brought low. Jesus called him out where he was. And he does the same thing to us. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But if you feel that somehow you failed God, you've got some kind of a sin that nobody knows about, you're hiding it in your closet, and it just shames you and it saps you from your strength, I want to offer you hope. It doesn't have to end that way. Things can turn around on a dime. Jesus is able to call you out where you're at. Light exposes darkness and overwhelms it so that it's not even there any longer. Another thing I'd like to mention out of this passage is Jesus' question. He asks, "Do you love me?" There are different kinds of love. In our language, we have one love. That same love is used for chocolate pudding as it is for your married spouse, or for your car, or for your job, or for whatever. In Greek, there are 3 words. One is eros, which talks about an erotic or sexual love, or lust. One is phileo, which is the brotherly love, the friendship that we have. And the other is agape. And agape is the highest form of love, the one where you are willing to put somebody else ahead of yourself, their interests ahead of yours, so that you are willing to sacrifice everything for that other person. Jesus asks Peter, actually, he asks Simon, son of Jonah, do you agape me more than these? More than the fish that you just spent all night trying to catch, and which I have just now given to you? Do you love me more than these? And Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. You're my friend. So Peter was not able to say, I agape you. He said, I phileo you. So Jesus asks him a second time, do you agape me? Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. And now Jesus brings it back down to Peter's level. Do you phileo me? Are you at least my friend? And this broke Peter's heart for a couple of reasons. One, he wasn't able to say that he agape God. He didn't love Jesus the way he should. But second of all, 3 times Jesus had to ask him this. One for each of the times that Peter rebelled against him and denied him. And there's a little principle there. When Jesus restores us into a right relationship with him, he takes care of all of the sin. He confronts all of it. And the consequences of our sin lasts. He helps us through it. But I really think of the Apostle Paul. He was a persecutor of the church. Before he was Paul, he was known as Saul. And he went around capturing people, torturing them. Even some of them were put to death. And then he became a believer himself. And on the same day that he was redeemed and Jesus revealed himself to Paul, he told him that you are going to have to suffer a lot of things for my name's sake. You can call that karma. I don't think that's the right word. But there's a leveling. There's a recognition that occurs that the grace that we receive is equal to the sin that we've committed. And those who have sinned much love much, but they also bear much consequence. And so Peter was being asked 3 times to match his 3 times, do you love me? And in Peter's response, he says, yes. Jesus replies, first, feed my lambs, then tend my sheep, and then feed my sheep. So who are the sheep? And what is he telling Peter to do? Well, in the immediate context, the sheep are the flock of Jesus. Jesus is the good shepherd, and Peter is being called to be the under shepherd. He was being called to tell people about Jesus and to grow them up in their faith. In the larger context, the sheep and the lambs are anybody who is within our care who need to know about Jesus. So, for me, you are the sheep. For you, if you have family members that are under your household, they are your sheep, and you are responsible to feed them. You're responsible to tend them and to watch over them, to make sure they have their quiet times and they're praying. That's your responsibility as a parent or as a household member. But there's also a larger theme for this. Not everybody is called to be an under shepherd, especially within the context of the church. But we all have gifts. And there are love languages out there, which we've talked about in the past. There are ways of sharing your love for others. You can tell them you love them. You can show affection through hugs. Or other ways, you can serve them. You can give them gifts. And you can give them words of affirmation. Well, Jesus is not asking for words of affirmation here from Peter. He's not asking for a hug. He's He's not asking for gifts. What he's asking for is service. If you love me, do this. So within the context of the church, you and I have a responsibility to find out what our gifts are, what our giftedness is, what the Holy Spirit has empowered us to do, and then to use them. Because the church is not here to entertain us. The church is not here to meet our needs, per se. The church is a body, an integrated unit. And each one of us that is a part of this body has a purpose beyond simply receiving. We are supposed to be bearing fruit, and we are supposed to be using our gifts so that other people can be helped. Yes, it is true our needs are met within the church, but they're met as we give, not as we receive. If everybody is doing their job in giving, I believe God gives us everything that we need as a church to function. Then Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. So he's telling Peter how he's going to die. Now, Peter, he ran away from the cross, but the time came later in his life when he was, in fact, crucified. And he had humbled himself to the point where he knew he was not worthy of dying the same death as his Lord. So he asked the people to crucify him upside down. He probably didn't last long in that position. So Peter was younger, and he girded himself. Girding is an interesting word. We don't really think of that word any longer. When we do, we think of it figuratively as preparing ourselves for something. If you recall, when Peter found out that it was the Lord on the beach, he put on his outer garment, and then he jumped into the water. Well, before he did that, he had to put a belt on. And that putting the belt on around his outer garment is called girding oneself, dressing oneself, preparing oneself. And Jesus is telling Peter the day is coming when he will no longer have control over himself. Other people are going to lord it over him and are going to tell him what to do. They're going to take him places he doesn't want to go. And in fact, he's going to die. He tells us the same thing. I hope you understand that. He wants us to count the cost of our discipleship. He did not promise us wealth and health and happiness. He promised us that we can be forgiven and that we can find love and joy and peace. That's not the same thing as health, wealth, and happiness. What he wants us to do is to give up all of our earthly treasures and to follow him and lay up our treasures in heaven. Are you ready for that? I hope so. Let's talk about the principles that are laid out in this passage regarding revival, because that's really what the bigger context of all this is. Restoration.